Today we're going to be talking about the equalizer, otherwise known as an EQ, and how we went from sounding like this on the radio
to sounding like this on the radio. We're going to talk about the different types of equalizers and how, when, and why to apply an equalizer in your mixing session. Hello everyone and welcome to WaveSpot. My name is Austin Knaus and I've spent over 2 decades working with audio. My goal for this channel is to share all the fundamentals that I've learned along the way and hopes to give you a fast track to understanding the world of sound. So, let's dive in. Over 100 years ago, in the 1920s, our radio broadcasting and telecommunications technology didn't have the ability to transmit full bandwidth audio. Full bandwidth being 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, the range of human hearing.
In fact, radio broadcasting and telecommunications technology only had the ability to transmit 300 hertz to 3400 hertz. And this is why audio and old school radios sounded like this.
Teaming up with audio engineers, the solution became the Western Audio 7A Equalizer. With the Western Electric 7A Equalizer, we were able to compensate for the lack of ability to transmit full bandwidth. We would boost everything below 300 hertz and boost everything above 3400 hertz. That way, when it got to the end listener, it actually kind of sounded a little bit more realistic instead of having that old-fashioned telephone sound. So the equalizer was actually designed to bring a little bit more life back into the radio broadcasting and telecommunication. So whenever you called somebody on the phone, they didn't sound like they were talking on a phone. They sounded more human. Now, jumping forward into the future, we have a lot of different types of equalizers, and we're going to cover a few and how they differ from each other. So first off, we have a graphical equalizer. Now, the graphical equalizer has fixed bands, so we can either boost or cut. We can either increase or attenuate the gain of a specific frequency. Now, let's say your graphical equalizer had a 200 hertz band and a 300 hertz band. You would not be able to boost or cut 250 because it was simply not on your equalizer. Not only do graphical equalizers have fixed bands, they also have fixed Q factors or fixed quality factors. A quality factor is how wide or narrow the band actually is. So whenever you boost that 300 hertz band, it's actually boosting a couple other frequencies around it. It's not just purely 300 hertz. It's actually probably 275 to 325, and 300 is centered in the middle of that, and you're moving all of those together. Next, we have the Semi-Parametric EQ. Now, this is a hybrid between a graphical equalizer and a parametric equalizer, and we'll talk about the full-blown parametric here in a little bit. What we need to know about the semi-parametric equalizer and how it relates to both the graphical equalizer and the parametric EQ is each band has a selectable frequency. So we have high, mid, and low. And with our high band, we have the ability to choose a select few different frequencies. In the mid band, we also have the ability to select a few different frequencies, and the low band is the same. It has the ability to select a few different frequencies. A very well-known EQ and dubbed the first semi-parametric EQ is the API 550-A. Not only is it a semi-parametric EQ with variable frequencies, it actually has a variable Q. So, whenever you boost, the higher you boost, the more narrow your Q gets, or the higher your Q gets. A high Q is equivalent to a narrow Q. A low Q is equivalent to a wide Q. So whenever we're using the API 550A, the higher you turn the gain up, the more narrow your Q gets. If you go up 2 dB, you're going to have a wide Q. If you go up the full 12 dB, you're going to have a very narrow Q. And it works in the opposite direction too. So if you go -2, you're going to be attenuating at a wide Q. If you go all the way down to -12, you're going to be attenuating at a very narrow Q or a very high Q. And that brings us into a fully parametric EQ. A parametric EQ has infinite control possibilities. Instead of having fixed bands like a graphical equalizer or a few select frequencies like a semi-parametric, a fully parametric EQ can sweep in between all of the individual frequencies. So if you wanted to target 120.5, you can do that. Especially in today's world, with all of our digital plugins on the computer, you can type in any number from 100.01 to 500.002. Not only do you have the ultimate amount of precision when it comes to the actual frequency you're dealing with, you actually have the ability to adjust the Q factor as well. So you can have a wide Q factor on a boost or a narrow Q factor on a cut. You can actually have 2 points overlap each other, and you can have different Q points on each one. So not only do you have the exact precision of what frequency you want to deal with, but you actually have the ability to adjust the Q size or the Q factor of each band on your EQ. This gives the parametric EQ an infinite amount of control over your sound. So let's jump into the DAW and listen to what an EQ is actually doing. So now we're inside Ableton and we're taking a look at Pro Q3, and we can see my voice on the spectrum analyzer inside of the EQ. This is my go-to EQ when it comes to parametric EQs, because no matter where I can click and point and it will make a new EQ point. Now that we've talked about some of the different types of EQs, let's talk about some of the different types of EQ curves. First off, we have the bell curve. Now, it looks like a bell. We can adjust our Q factor, whether it's a low Q or it's a high Q, and we can boost it or we can cut. We can also select what frequency it's at, whether it's at a low frequency or it's a high frequency. A bell curve targets the different areas of the frequency spectrum, and it allows us to alter the sound in a very specific area. If we wanted to get rid of all of the high end of my voice, we can do that. If we wanted to get rid of all of the low end of my voice, we can also do that. Next up, we have the shelf. A shelf can either be a low shelf or it can be a high shelf, and we can either boost or cut on the high end or the low end. Now we can scoot it all the way up or scoot it all the way down. If we have a high Q factor, it actually gives us these notches right here. If we have a low Q factor, it is more of a gentle slope, as you can see here. So what a shelf is good for is adding a little bit more on the top or taking a little bit away. What we can do is add more bass in my voice, or we can take the bass away. Now it doesn't take it all away, it just lowers it as a group, if you will. Well, what happens if we actually want to take all of the frequencies away? Well, we can start with a low cut. A low cut is also called a high pass. So you can see I'm cutting out everything that's below the low cut. But what you can also see is everything inside this green area is being left, or it's passing through. So it's called a high pass. So a low cut or a high pass is the same thing. If we have a high Q with a low cut, we get this resonant peak before it gets rid of everything below it. And same with a high cut. A high cut or a low pass cuts everything out of the highs and only allows the lows to pass. Now, if we wanted to, if you remember from earlier, if we go to 3400 and we can go to 300 hertz, this was all of the bandwidth that the telecommunications could transmit. And that's why the radio sounded like this, because we didn't have our full bandwidth. And what we can do is increase the amount of lows and increase the amount of highs, and then we get our full bandwidth. Next, we have the notch filter. Now, the notch filter is notching out, as you can see here, the very center. It's getting rid of a specific piece of the frequency spectrum. Now, let's say there was a very annoying sound or a very annoying frequency in a very specific spot, but you didn't want to get rid of the whole sound. What you can do is you can get a notch filter, and that will allow you to specify a very specific place inside of your frequency range to just get rid of entirely. If we widen the Q, if we go low, we can get rid of a lot more frequencies. If we narrow the Q, we can get very precise on the exact frequency that we're dealing with. The next type of curve is a band filter. Now, this is kind of like both a low pass and a high pass at the same time. And what it does is it specifies or gets very specific on what frequency it's focusing on. So as you can see, there's a specific band, whether it's the first decade, second decade, third decade. Very specific in what it's looking at. We can see that it's focusing on a very specific frequency at any given point of time. Next, we have the tilt shift curve. This is like having a high shelf and a low shelf on a single pivot point. If I boost the gain, I get more highs and less lows. If I cut the gain, I get more lows and less highs. If I add a high Q factor, I get my resonant peaks, just like a shelf would. Or if I give it a low Q, it rounds out and becomes smooth, just like the shelf would be. Next, we have the flat tilt. This removes the ability to change the Q, and it's just simply a flat tilt. So it's going to give me more bass and less highs when I attenuate, and more highs and less bass when I boost. So now that we've covered the different shapes, let's get into some practical uses for each one. All right, so I have this little loop here, and I have a kick drum, a bass line, a synth, a snare, and some percussion. So let's go ahead and take a listen to each one of these on their own really quick. So that was our kick. Now let's go into our bass line. Now the synth. And the snare. And the percussion. Little shaker, tambourine, and some hi-hats in there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to use the different EQ curves to kind of make this a little bit more cohesive. So if we play them all together really quick, we can kind of get an understanding of what it sounds like. So first off, what I want to do is I want to look at the bass. And before I do anything with the bass, I want to look at the level that the bass is at. So we can see we're at negative 3.83 here. So let's make some EQ adjustments now. So we can see that everywhere below 20,000 all the way up to 20,000 is being occupied. Well, I can tell you now we don't need any of this information up at the top for our bass line. It's just taking up sonic space. So let's EQ some of that out. First, we're going to start with the low end. We can see that we have a peak over here. So we're going to tuck this up to 40 hertz. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take another high cut, and and we're going to bring it down until it starts to sound like we're snuffing our bass out, and then we're going to let off a little bit. Right around there. Now that we've done the EQ adjustment, let's go back and check our volume level and gain stage. So before, negative 2.43. Let's turn this back on. Negative 2.14. So that's fairly close. We can see I adjusted it minus 1.4 dB there. So let's go to the synth next. And as we process these, we're going to leave them all on as we go. So we process one, we leave it on, we go to the next one, so we can kind of make comparisons and our adjustments based off of what the song as a whole sounds like. You don't want to EQ things individually and then try to fit it in later, because it's kind of relative operating. So let's take a look at the synthesizer really quick. So with the bass on and the synth on, let's make our EQ adjustments with them both together. So we know that we don't need all of that bass inside of the synth track. So let's take a low cut and we'll get rid of all of the things that are conflicting with our bass. So around the, we'll call it 200. We can just type in 200 mark. So around the 200 mark, it gets rid of everything below, but leaves enough highs that it doesn't sound shallow or without depth. Now let's get a high cut and get rid of all of the high-end information that we don't need. So just like the bass line, what we're going to do is we're going to bring it down until it sounds like we're starting to snuff the synth out, and then we'll bring it back a little bit. So right around 16K. So now let's go check the volume of before and after and see if we can match it. So before, it's around 11.1, negative 11.1. So after, we're around negative 14. So now what we can do is we can actually boost this by 3. Let's go plus 4. So that's right about the same. All right, next, let's get into our snare. So first off, we can see all this low-end information. We don't need any of that, so we can cut all that out. Our snare does sound kind of weak, so let's give it a little bit of a high Q and boost some of the pop of the snare. Then what we can do, I hear this is kind of harsh up here. Now let's go back and check our gain structure again. So before, we're sitting at a solid -2. After, we're sitting at -3.17. So let's boost this to 0.193. So 1.3 gives us around -2.10. So before and then after. So we have a little bit more body and a little less harshness. Now let's get into the percussion. We can see all of this low information down here. We don't need any of that for the percussion. So I brought this low cut up enough that it doesn't sound like it's shallow information. But low enough that it gives us some body, but doesn't conflict with our synthesizer or our bass or anything like that. So now that we have all of those done, let's get into our kick drum. So our kick drum has a full spectrum of information. It goes from 20 hertz all the way to 20,000 hertz. Let's tailor this to the track. So we know the bass sits around 40 hertz. So let's actually cut this low cut around, let's say 55 hertz. Bring that up. We'll give it a little bit of a high Q factor to give us some punch. Let's rock with 50. So this 200 hertz range is kind of boxy. I'll bring that down a little bit. And this high end information is kind of clicky. And I don't need all of this high information, but I'm not going to get rid of it. I'm just going to turn it down, because even though it's a kick drum and it's kind of bass centric, it mimics the beater of an actual acoustic drum kit. The beater makes a high pitched noise, and the actual bass drum itself is what's making the low pitched noise. All right, so let's take a look at our volume before and after our EQ. So before, we're sitting about -1.01 dB. Now after, we're actually about a dB quieter. So let's go and blow this up by 1 dB. Let's bring it up by 1.8. So now this is almost exactly where it was before we even put our EQ on. So before the EQ, after. All right. So now that we've EQ'd everything, let's listen to it before and after. So what I want you to take away from this is every time I made an EQ adjustment or I applied an EQ, it's because of a very specific reason. There was a reason why I EQ'd it. I didn't just throw on an EQ because that's what I think I should do. I applied the EQ to get rid of unnecessary information or to alter the tone of the kick drum to make it fit into the mix a little bit more. Now, EQs can be creative tools. They could be logical tools. You can use them to shape your sound in a specific way, or you can use it to mix things and blend things together to make them sound more cohesive. The important thing with EQ is that you don't mix with your eyes and you mix with your ears. If you mix with your eyes and you just look at all the different peaks and valleys and you start making your decisions by those means, then you're going to absolutely destroy your audio. You're going to mess up your mixes and it's not going to sound good because it looks good. What looks good doesn't always sound good, but what sounds good always sounds good. If you found any of today's information valuable, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps out the channel. If you learned something new or if you still have questions, make sure to leave a comment below. I love responding to you guys. And if you want to read more on the topic, head over to wavespot.com where I have much more detail written in a blog post along with all of the illustrations to make it make sense. And until next time, thanks for watching.